Tales from Eastern and Southern Asia. The Four Young Men, from Burma. In a certain village there lived 4 men, and they could make up strange and impossible tales. One day they saw a traveler resting in the rest house outside the village, and he was wearing fine clothes. The 4 young men plotted to take these fine clothes away from him, so they went to the rest house and started a conversation. After a while, one of the young men suggested that they all join in a contest. "Let each one of us tell about his most wonderful adventure," he said. "Anyone who doubts the truth of the story will become the slave of the man who tells it." The traveler agreed to the idea, and the young men smiled to themselves, thinking him to be a fool. He did not look as though he could tell impossible stories, but even so they couldn't lose the contest if they merely said they believed his tale. On the other hand, they expected their own tales would be so thoroughly unbelievable that the traveler would have to protest. They did not really intend to make the traveler their slave, but merely to claim his clothes, since the property of a slave was the property of his master. So they went to the village and brought back the head man to act as a judge of the contest. The first young man then began his wonderful adventure. "Before I was born, my mother asked my father to pick some plums from the tree in front of the house, but my father replied that the tree was too high to climb. My mother asked my brothers, but they gave the same answer. I couldn't bear to see my mother disappointed, so I climbed the tree and picked the plums myself when no one was looking. I left them on the kitchen table. No one knew where the plums had come from, but my mother was very pleased." The young man looked at the traveler, hoping that he would express doubt as to the truth of the story, but he merely nodded his head to show that he believed it. The other 3 young men also nodded their heads. So it was the second young man's turn, and he said, "When I was a week old, I took a walk in the forest, and saw a large date tree with ripe fruit on it. As I was very hungry, I climbed up the tree swiftly and began eating dates. When I had eaten all that I could, I was so heavy and sleepy that I couldn't climb down. So I went back to the village and brought a ladder. I propped it against the tree and came down by its rungs. If I hadn't found the ladder, I would still be up in the date tree." He looked at the traveler, expecting to hear some protest, but the traveler merely nodded his head in agreement. So did the other 3 young men. It was the third young man's turn to tell his impossible tale. "When I had reached the ripe old age of 1 year, I saw a rabbit running swiftly into the tall grass, and I chased it. When I caught up with it, I discovered that what I had been chasing was really a tiger. He opened his mouth to swallow me. I told him this was very unfair, because what I was looking for was a rabbit and not a tiger. But he took no notice of my protests and opened his mouth even wider. Becoming annoyed at his rudeness, I caught hold of him with my left hand and broke him in two." Again the young men looked expectantly at the traveler, waiting for him to deny the truth of the story. But he nodded his head in agreement. So the fourth young man told his story. "Last year I went fishing in a small boat, but I couldn't catch a single fish. I asked the other fishermen, and they hadn't caught any fish either. I decided to see what was the matter at the bottom of the river. I dived out of my boat and swam down. After about 3 days I reached the bottom of the river, and I discovered a fish as large as a mountain there, eating all the small fish. I killed the great fish with one blow of my fist. After all this exercise I was beginning to feel a little hungry, so I decided to eat the fish right there. I lit a fire, and after roasting the fish I ate it all at one sitting. Then I floated back up to my boat and went home." The young men waited for the traveler to laugh at this monstrous tale, or to cry out, "Oh, this is unbelievable!" But he merely nodded his head in agreement. And then it was his turn to tell of an adventure. He began, "Some years ago I had a farm. There was one fruit tree on my farm that grew differently from the others. It had 4 branches but no leaves. On the end of each branch, however, was a single fruit. When they were ripe, I picked the 4 fruits, and when I cut them open, a young man jumped out of each one of them. As they came from my tree, they were legally my property, that is to say, my slaves. I made them work on my farm, but being lazy and much preferring to sit around and tell tales than do work, they ran away after only a few weeks. Since that time I have been traveling all over the country looking for them, and I am very gratified that now, here in this rest house, I have found them at last. Young men, you know very well that you are my runaway slaves. come back with me to my farm, and don't give me any trouble." The 4 young men couldn't say a word. They couldn't shake their heads one way or another. They were greatly embarrassed, for they were in a hopeless position. If they declared that the man's story was true, they would be acknowledging that they were his runaway slaves. If they said the story was false, though, they would lose the contest and become his slaves anyway. So they were silent. The headman of the village asked them whether they believed the traveler's tale or not. They were silent. He asked them again. They would not speak. Once more he asked. They remained mute. And so the headman declared that the stranger had won the contest. The traveler said to the young men, "Now you are my slaves. Since you are my slaves, your clothes belong to me. Take off your clothes and give them to me. After that I will give you your freedom." The young men removed their clothes and gave them to him. The traveler had the clothes in a bundle, put it on his back, and resumed his journey, while the 4 young clever men stood naked in the rest house.